Hello and welcome to the Beach House 34 podcast. I'm your host, Christine Worth. Welcome to all of the new subscribers and welcome back to our dedicated listeners. I want to thank Helen for buying me a coffee and helping to support this podcast. If you'd like to do the same and get a shout out, the link is in the show notes below. Now, this episode is a continuing series on the trial readings for the Darlie Routier case, a mother who was accused and convicted in 1996 of murdering her two children in Rowlett, Texas, and is currently on death row. As soon as the trial readings are completely finished, I'll be back to doing weekly true crime and paranormal cases. Now, in the last episode, we heard the third part of Darin's testimony, and today we'll finish up and hear what else Darin had to say. And to just briefly cover what we talked about in the last episode, which was Darin number 3. Darin had talked about his Jaguar breaking down, initially claiming that it cost $3 to fix, but later stated it was around an $800 repair. He also talked about his projected 1996 income, how he was late on some of his rent for his business property. And what I found was surprising that I had not known was especially about the alarm system that the Routiers had on their home and how it was not set the night of the crime. So if you're interested, I'll have the link to the last episode, to Darin number 3, in the show notes below. So if you haven't yet listened to that, I highly suggest it. It has some pretty interesting information. Now, in the last episode, also, we ended with the court had given the jury a morning break. They have now left the room, and there is some discussion before the jury comes back in from their morning break. So that's where we're going to begin today. And the court then says, all right, let the record reflect that all parties in the trial are present in these proceedings. Mr. Mosty then says, Your Honor. The court says, these proceedings are being held, all parties at trial are present, and these proceedings are being held outside the presence of the jury. Mr. Mosty then continues, I just had one more thought about why that illegal bug is relevant. The court says, all right. Mr. Mosty says, and it relates to, for instance, all of the reports, but I can't remember. This is Mr. Patterson's entire file, this red folder. And I think it was marked for record purposes. The court says it was. Mr. Mosty says, I don't see a sticker, but yes, it was marked for record purposes as Defendant's Exhibit number 72. And what is notoriously missing from this report and all of the reports is any report of this illegal bug. For instance, you will recall that they brought in the Garland Canine Unit. I think it was Garland. It was some other city. Anyway, and Mr. Mulder says it was. Mr. Mosty continues, it was Garland, and there is a Garland canine report, and in all of these records, there is not one reference in Garland or Rowlett or anywhere else to this illegal bug. And so that raises the question of, what else did they leave out, as we have gone through all this stuff about never taking any notes? Another reason that all of this is relevant is, and it goes to what they chose to write down and what they chose not to write down and what they chose to leave out. And this goes directly to that as a relevance to impeach these officers and how they went about this investigation. The court says, thank you. That is now in the record. Let's bring the jury in, please. Mr. Mosty then says, do I surmise that that would be overruled? The court says, yes, that is overruled. Mr. Mulder says, Judge, we don't find it curious that they have, the court says, gentlemen, we have concluded this hearing. That hearing is over. Mr. Mulder says, well, we just thought of some new things we thought you might want to entertain. And Mr. Mosty says, we've still got to keep pointing these things out, and we might think of others. And the court says, I'm sure you will. Mr. Mulder says, can we not confer? The court says, you may confer with each other. Yes. Mr. Mulder says, thank you, Judge. Thank you, Judge. The court says, now, in the meantime, we will bring the jury back in. So the jury is brought back into the courtroom, and the court says, let the record reflect that all parties in the trial are present and the jury is seated. Mr. Mulder, Anybody have anything else? Thank you. Mr. Mulder then says yes, and his redirect begins. Just a thing or two, Darin. You've never doubted your wife's innocence, have you? No, sir. You were asked about the towels and about how many towels were in that room, in the den, and in the hall, and in the area where the action was? Probably 5 or 6. Do you know how many? Not exactly, no. Did you get any towels? No, sir, I didn't. Did Waddell or Walling or any of the police officers get any towels? No, sir, they didn't. Did the paramedics get any towels to your knowledge? No, sir. The towels that were there came out of your towel drawer, didn't they? Yes, sir, they did. All right. Who was left to get the towels? Darlie. Was she just getting the towels in the sink and throwing them at you, or was she bringing them to you? She was bringing them to me. That makes sense, doesn't it? Yes, sir. Is there any other way that that would be done? No, sir. Was she there? And did she wipe Devin's chest as you blew into his mouth? Yes, sir, she was there. Got the blood off of him? Yes, sir. Did you think that that was something that a mother would do to comfort her son under those circumstances? Does that seem unreasonable to you that she would do that? No, it's not unreasonable at all. Now, when these statements were given by you and by Darlie, did you, at the time, request the officers to video record or tape record your part? Yes, sir. I told him that I could not write down as fast as I can think, and that he said he would just go in with some notes and some other things that he wanted to fill in. All right, so they didn't question you while you were giving your statement as to what they thought might be important? You were just to write down what you thought was important? Is that right? Mr. Greg Davis then says, I'm sorry, I'm going to object to that as being leading. The court says, overruled. I'll let him answer it if he knows the answer. Go ahead. The witness says, no, sir, they just asked me. They just basically told me to write what I could remember, and I did in a very quick manner. Mr. Mulder then continues, has your memory improved since the event? Yes, sir, very much so. Over the recess, I was reading through your statement. Did you put in your statement initially? Is there something in there that after the police got there, you went upstairs and put your pants on? No, sir, I had my pants on. But didn't you put it in your statement? I put in my statement that I couldn't remember putting my pants on before I went downstairs. I knew I had my glasses on because I can't see 2 feet in front of me. Well, I mean, when you gave the statement, you put in there that it wasn't until the police got there that you went upstairs and put your pants on. I knew that couldn't be true. But that is in your statement, isn't it? Yes, sir. That means you were down there naked? No, sir, I was not down there naked. I think I would have been embarrassed if the police officers would have started coming in and I would have been standing there stark naked. Has your memory gotten progressively better with time? Yes, sir, it has. Did you remember more of what happened on the 8th than you did on the 6th, and more on the 10th than you did on the 8th, and more on the 20th than you did on the 10th? Yes, sir. And more as we go down the line? A lot more now. Okay. Do you find that unusual? No, sir. Given the circumstances? No, sir. I have had a lot of time to think about all this. In your effort to reconstruct things with Darlie, did y'all go to a psychic? Yes, sir, we did. Did a psychic tell you and her what the psychic thought happened? Yes, sir. Okay. We were looking for answers that the police couldn't tell us. Just looking for help anywhere you could get it? Yes, sir. And did the psychic have a theory about what this man did? Mr. Davis says, I'm going to object to that as being hearsay from a psychic. The court says, sustained. Mr. Mulder says, I'm not going to go into what. Mr. Mulder then just continues his questioning. Did the psychic have a version, a sort of phrenology, where you feel the bumps on your head, reconstruction of the scene? Mr. Davis says, I'm going to object to that. Again, whether she has got an opinion or not, it's still hearsay. Mr. Mulder says, Judge, if the FBI agent can testify, then we can hear what the psychic has to say. Mr. Davis says, well, if the psychic wants to come in here and testify, let her. The court says, gentlemen, the objection is sustained. Rephrase your question. Mr. Mulder says, did y'all talk to a psychic? Yes, sir, we did. Did Darlie relate to you that she had had dreams and nightmares concerning this attack? Yes, sir. We've both had a lot of nightmares. And are the dreams and nightmares different versions of what her version was to you about Damon coming in and tapping her on the shoulder? Are they different? Well, yes. Yes, sir. Okay. Mr. Davis has had a number of questions about your finances and your business. Will you tell the jury what your expenses were? I think we know your rent was $525 a month. Yes, sir. I had just paid all my equipment off. We had taken a loan out for about $75,000 on equipment, and it was all paid by January. So all of a sudden, we had almost $3,000 a month extra per month that we weren't used to having because we had made, it's like paying off a house in 3 years. I understand that, but I want to get to the point here. Individually, what my bills were? Tell us what your fixed expenses were each month. About $5,000 a month. All right. That includes what? Electricity, phone bills. I have 3 phones. Rent, labor is usually the highest, the highest amount that you have to pay. Did that include Baja? Yes, sir, it did. During your personal knowledge of her, has she had mental difficulties? Yes, sir. Mr. Davis says, I'll object to that, Your Honor. This is an area that we have already discussed. The court says, sustained. Let's move on. Mr. Mulder continues. Are you personally aware? Mr. Greg Davis says, again, I'm going to object to that if it deals with the same area. I assume it will. The court says, well, let him ask the question first. Mr. Davis says, may we approach the bench for a moment? The court says, yeah, I can see both sides up here. So at this point in time, everybody approaches the bench. This is not on the record, so we don't know what was said. But then once it is resumed on the record, this is what follows. The court says, Mr. Mulder, I have already ruled on that. You are instructed not to ask any questions in that area. I have already ruled on that. Mr. Mulder says, can I get it on the record? The court says, I will put it in the record once we get through. All right? Let's move on to the next question, please. Mr. Mulder then continues. Let me hand you what has been marked for identification and record purposes as Defendant's Exhibit number 81. I will ask you if you recognize that and can identify it. Yes, sir. And is that true and accurate? Yes, sir. Bank statement? Yes, sir. Concerning your business? Balance? Yes, sir. This shows your bank statement through June of 1996 through June 30th. Is that right? Yes, sir. And it shows a bank balance of June 30th of how much? $7,941.10. Okay. Now, I believe you have already testified that you had some 18 or 20,000 in accounts receivable at that time? Yes, sir. That were good accounts receivable? Yes, sir. And that have since been collected? Yes, sir. You were asked about an American Express bill? Yes, sir. Remember, I wanted you to explain that, and he went on to something else? Yes, sir. Did you pay that bill? Yes, sir, I did. Was your house payment current? Yes, sir. In June? Yes, sir, it was. I made the bank payment. The June payment wasn't late until the 15th. I just hadn't written out the bills yet. Maybe we're beating this thing to death, but with that Gangster's Paradise, and I frankly hadn't heard it until the other day, and I cannot recite any of the lyrics. Mr. Davis says, I'm going to object to that as really sidebar. The court says, well, I think I will let. Mr. Davis says, let's do a question, not leading. Mr. Mulder says, Judge, if it gets much more complicated than George Strait or Willie Nelson, I don't listen to the words. The court says, oh, I understand. Mr. Mulder, I understand. Well, let's ask the question. Yes. Mr. Mulder then continues. Do you listen to the words of those things? No, sir, I don't. Do you think your children understand what the words are, or, if they hear the words, understand the meaning? No, sir, I think they just understand the beat. They like the beat and the rhythm and that sort of thing, right? Right. They jump around all over the floor and dance. When you and Darlie, they gave you your warnings when you, on that affidavit sheet, It's got your warnings there, quote, that you have a right to remain silent, that you have a right to a lawyer. If you can't afford a lawyer will be appointed to you for counsel with you prior to or during any questioning by the police, and you have a right to terminate the interview at any time, unquote. That is basically your Miranda warnings. You are familiar with those now? Yes, sir, I am. You had never had those warnings given to you before, had you? No, sir. In fact, other than an estate planning lawyer, you have never even talked to a lawyer? Yes, sir, and we never even talked to him. Now, when Mr. Patterson and Mr. Frosch asked you to give statements, did you hide behind your Fifth Amendment right to remain silent and not say anything at all, or did you tell them, I told them everything. I didn't have anything to hide. You answered all of their questions? Yes, sir. You gave them keys to your house and your boat and storage and the company, didn't you? Yes, sir. I gave them keys to everything I had. There has been some talk about insurance. Did you have several $100,000 worth of insurance on your life? I have $800,000 worth of life insurance on me. All right. How much did you have on Darlie? I believe 200,000. All right. And the children? It was just a family policy where there was $5,000 on each of the children? Yes, sir. And they just add them on as you have them. You were asked about a sock, and you said you had never seen that sock. Is this one of y'all's towels? Yes, sir. Do you recognize these as towels? Yes, sir. Kitchen towels. Let me just ask you. And then Mr. Mulder says, of course, it would be on the very bottom. The court says, always the way. Mr. Mulder then says, why is that always the last place you look? And the court says, just fate. Mr. Mulder then continues, what did you do with old socks? We had a rag pile. Okay, this sock was described as having some holes in it other than the obvious holes that you see. That is a pretty holy sock. Well, some places there are marks on it, and other places there are holes and no marks, indicating that it was worn. Yes, sir. I suspect, did you wear socks with multiple holes in them? No, sir. Is this the type of sock that you wore? Tube sock? Yes, sir. Okay. Do you have any reason to believe that this is not one of your old socks? What if you flipped it around? See where the heel is? Just by guessing at it, I would say that it was my sock. That is your sock? Yes, sir. Okay, where would you put a sock that had holes in it we had a basket on top of the washer and dryer, and we would just use them for rags, just for waxing the cars, cleaning up around the house. Cleaning up around the house. Plenty to do with 3 boys, I guess. Oh, yeah. I mean, the more you clean, the more there is to clean. Yes, sir. It's like shoveling sand against the tide, isn't it? Yes, sir. Mr. Greg Davison says, again, if we could stop with the leading, please. The court says, sustained. Let's stop the sidebar and the leading. Let's phrase our questions both sides, please. You are both experienced attorneys. Let's everyone phrase the questions properly. Mr. Mulder says, Judge, excuse me, I'm just trying to move along on some of the things that are obvious. The court says, and we appreciate that, Mr. Mulder. Mr. Mulder says, thank you. The court says, all right. And Mr. Mulder then continues. Let me ask you this, and I made a note of it. Did Darlie, when you went to see her in the hospital, did she at any time complain about or remark about an injury to her mouth? Yes, sir, she did. What was that? When I first got in there, some other family members were giving her ice chips and feeding her ice chips because her lips were just all swollen like this. You could see the cuts on the inside of her mouth. Mr. Mulder then says, okay, I believe that's all. The court says, Mr. Davis. Mr. Greg Davis says, yes, sir. And the recross begins by Mr. Greg Davis. Mr. Routier, it's really more accurate to say that your memory got better every time we got a test result back in this case, didn't it? No, sir. Every time we found out something else, you remembered something else that would correspond with that finding, didn't you? No, sir. What I remember is exactly what is the truth. So that when Mr. Mulder said that your memory was better on September the 12th than it had been on June 8th, and now it's better than it was in September, of course, we have had all of these test results come back. And you are privy to all them now, aren't you? Not necessarily. You pretty much know everything that has happened in this case, haven't you? Yes, sir, but the truth doesn't have anything to do with the test results. Let me show you again. States Exhibit 83-B. This is the letter I showed you yesterday. Do you remember me showing you this letter, sir? Yes, sir. And let me ask you, is your memory better about that today? Do you remember that is one of the letters addressed to you now? Yes, sir. Okay. Mr. Davis then says, Your Honor, at this time, we will offer States Exhibit 83-B. And the court says, any objection? Mr. Mulder says, I thought that came in yesterday. Mr. Davis says, no, sir, just 83-A. He said he didn't remember that one yesterday. The court says, any objection? Mr. Mulder says, Judge, just a moment. No, we don't have any objection. The court says, States Exhibit 83-B is admitted. And then Mr. Greg Davis continues. Judge, may I publish this briefly? The court says you may. And Mr. Davis says, ladies and gentlemen, this is a letter from Mellon Mortgage Company, May the 8th, 1996, addressed to Darin E. Routier and Darlie L. Routier in reference to a loan number. Quote, Dear mortgager, your situation is serious. Your mortgage payments for April and May of 1996 have not been received and you are in default of your loan. Mellon Mortgage would like to help you, including late charges. The total amount past due is $2,525.74. If payments are not received by May 23rd, 1996, you risk foreclosure. You could lose your home. Additionally, a deficiency judgment could be sought against you for any losses that might result. It then goes on with instructions as to payment of these charges. Mr. Davis then continues, Sir, the situation by June the 3rd had gotten to the point where you got rejected on a $5,000 loan at Bank One. You remember that, don't you? Yes, sir. That was an unsecured loan. Okay. You remember dealing with an Okie Williams, correct? Yes, sir, I do. And the bottom line on that transaction, sir, was that they would not loan you $5,000 unsecured, would they? Not unsecured, no, but they would secured. You didn't get that $5,000 from Bank One, did you? I wasn't too heartbroken about it either. Could you please answer my question? Did you get the $5,000? Did we get the loan? No. Okay. That document, Defendant's Exhibit 81, that summary from Bank One that deals with the month of June, it shows deposits of $11,756. Is that correct? Yes, sir. Okay. And again, it shows, and only $7,000 came out. Right. Checks paid of $7,154.09, correct? Yes, sir. So if we're correct, for the first 5 months of 96 that you have receipts for $74,000, if we add these deposits of $85,000, we now have the receipts for 6 months of 1996, don't we? 5 months. No, sir. I mean, I am including through June. 1 through 6? Yes, sir. Right. We have $85,000 received and deposited in Bank One by TestNet, don't we? Yes, sir. 2 times 85,000 is how much money, sir? 2 times 85,000? Yes, sir. 170 some thousand? Okay. That is $90,000 less than your company earned in 1995. Is that correct? That is not adding the $20,000 that I still had on the books open. No, I'm just talking about monies that you had received and put in there. Yes, sir. And these represent accounts receivable for earlier months, don't they? Yes, sir. $170 something as opposed to $260,000. Would you agree with me that that is a difference of $90,000? Yes, sir, it would have been. And when you came into court on July the 1st on that bond hearing, it's fair to say you were trying to portray yourself as poor as you could that day, weren't you? Yes, sir, that's true. I am broke. Because on July the 1st, when you were asked about how much money was in this account that shows $7,941 on June 30th, Do you remember what you told this court, how much money you had in that bank account then on July the 1st? I was guessing about 2,500. Well, actually, you guessed a little bit lower than that. 2,000? Yeah. I asked, quote, how much money do you have in that account? And quote, about $2,000. You were about $6,000 short on July 1st, weren't you? I don't recall. Well, $7,941 minus $2,000 is what? $5,941? Yes, sir. Of course, that was on July 1st. Now, the situation is that you are trying to paint this one as rosy as you can about your finances, aren't you? There was nothing wrong with my finances. July the 1st, I just hadn't had the money come in yet. On June the 8th, you said that you asked or said that you wanted these police officers to videotape or audio tape what you were saying because you really didn't trust them to get down everything that you were writing or that you were saying to them, right? I just can't write everything that I think. You have had a lot of discussions with these attorneys. Have they written down notes of what you have told them? Very little. I don't know. Well, I would imagine, given that fact, that you have obviously then asked them to audio or videotape you, haven't you? Make sure that they get it down right? No, sir, I haven't. Would it be fair to say that really, back on June the 6th, by your version, we have got a real lucky intruder, don't we? There was an intruder. A lucky intruder? Why lucky? I mean, after all, he picked a house where the window just happened to be open to the garage, right? Yes, sir. Just happened to pick a house where on that night the alarm system is not turned on or armed, correct? Yes, sir. Lucky that, in fact, once he gets past the alarm system off, he gets through the window open. When he gets into the utility room, he just happens to find a sock available to him for his use that night, right? Yes, sir. And lucky enough that when he does that, he gets into the kitchen and lo and behold, there in the butcher block, he finds a weapon to attack your 2 children and your wife, right? My understanding is that it is called an opportunist. No, my question is, he was lucky enough that evening that once he got past all that, the murder weapon is actually provided inside the house, right? Yes, sir. Lucky enough that while he is attacking both your children, your wife doesn't wake up, right? Yes, sir. Lucky enough that after he attacks her, that in fact, she doesn't even get a good look at his face, right? Yes, sir. Lucky enough that as he is leaving the house, he drops the knife on the floor there, and your wife doesn't pick it up and doesn't use it against him, right? Yes, sir. Lucky enough that when he gets into the garage that he doesn't deposit any blood on the floor. No blood on the window, correct? I don't know anything about that. And then lucky enough that when he leaves out that garage into your backyard, that he either scales that fence without leaving a mark, or he opens up that gate and he then latches and closes it without anybody detecting that either, right? Yes, sir. A real lucky guy, wasn't he? Yeah, and I want him dead. So do I. Mr. Greg Davis then says no further questions. And the redirect is then begun by Mr. Mulder. I guess he is lucky that the police didn't pursue the leads that they received. Exactly. Lucky that when people called in, having seen a man with a black ball cap and a black t-shirt and jeans in the vicinity, that the police didn't pursue it. They never looked. Lucky enough that when Angel Rickles got a hold of them and they came out to her house, they weren't interested. Yes, sir. Lucky enough that the police are not interested in pursuing the fingerprint that the man left as he went out that window. Yes, sir. You aren't responsible for the luck or the happenstance of some crazy assailant, are you? No, sir. Anything more precious to you than those 2 youngsters? Nothing. There is nothing more important than those boys to us. Have you ever doubted your wife's innocence? No, sir. Do you doubt it now? No, sir. Mr. Mulder then says, I believe that's all we have. Mr. Davis says, I don't have any further questions. I would offer State's Exhibit 141, the voluntary statement given on June the 8th. The court says, any objection? Mr. Mulder says, "Is that his statement?" Mr. Davis says, "Yes, sir." And Mr. Mulder says, "No objection. We'll call just a minute. State's Exhibit 141 is admitted." And once Mr. Mulder says, "will call," there is not a name in this particular transcript. I'm going to assume that they are talking about Dr. DeMaio, but it's not actually specifically in this piece of the testimony, or at least in the transcript. And then Mr. Shook, Toby Shook says, "Judge, could we have a 7:05 hearing pursuant to the expert testimony, please?" And the court says, "Well, you certainly can. The jury will step back into the jury room, please." And that is where we end Darin's testimony, at least for now. So let's go over and recap what we've learned. I know that this has kind of been a shorter one, but there was some good information in here. Now, the testimony first begins with Mr. Mosty talking about having gone through Detective Patterson's folder that had been admitted into evidence. He mentions that in this folder, this red folder, there is absolutely no mention at all of the microphone found at the gravesite. And he wonders that, hey, if this was left out, who knows what else was left out, and wants to impeach the officers. So just essentially, from what I understand, strike their testimony. What is kind of strange, though, is that the court just says, "Thank you. It's now in the record, bring the jury in," without ruling on what Mr. Mosty was asking about. Now, Mr. Mosty has to ask the judge if that means it was overruled. And the court says, yes, it is overruled. So when both Mulder and Mosty, Darlie's defense attorneys, begin to ask about if it was something curious, the court just says that the hearing is over and it has been concluded, and then say to the judge that they thought that he might want to entertain this information and that they also might find other things related to this microphone issue. And the court says, "I'm sure you will." The judge seems distracted to me, not even wanting to give them a few seconds to explain their findings. And before you know it, the jury is brought back in, and the redirect of Darin is begun by Mr. Mulder of the defense team. So this is what he had to say. Mulder brings up a good point about these towels to start off with. He asks Darin if anyone, the police, the paramedics, even himself, were the ones to get the towels and bring them over to the children. And he said no. So honestly, that leaves only one person, doesn't it? And that's Darlie. And it makes total sense. How else were those towels supposed to get there? Also, in the last episode, I mentioned something what I thought personally about the wet or dry towels, meaning that if you wanted to soak something up, you'd use something dry, not wet, but that if you wanted to soothe something like a cut, you'd get the towel wet. So in this case, according to Darin, that's exactly what Darlie was doing, wiping away blood from one of the boys as he attempted to save his life. So let's talk about Darin's pants, okay? The defense asks Darin if he put in his statement, his written statement to the police, whether or not he had gone upstairs to put his pants on. Now, in this statement on June 8th, this written statement, he does say on page 3 that he ran upstairs to put his pants on. But during this testimony, he said he had his pants on. Then he said that he couldn't remember putting his pants on before he went downstairs. Then he said that he went upstairs and put his pants on after the police got there, but he said that he knew that couldn't be true because he slept without any clothes on and he would have been embarrassed. Now, the thing is that in his initial statement, and this was just 2 days after the crime, he said he went upstairs and put his pants on. Then he said he couldn't remember if he put his pants on before going downstairs. And then he agreed that he did say this in the statement, that he had gone to put his pants on when the police arrived, but then said that it couldn't be true because he would have been embarrassed. I'm totally confused about this. There's so many different pants theories that come from Darin. And to make things even more complicated, In an earlier testimony, this same testimony at the trial that we're discussing right now, this whole section of Darin's testimony, Darin said, quote, "I jumped up and I put on my glasses and I put my pants on and I ran down the stairs as fast as I could." He says this in this same testimony. So the bottom line is regarding his pants, there are multiple conflicting stories being told by Darin about this. Then there are his glasses. Each time he refers to this night, the night of the crime, he says he has his glasses on. In his statement, in his written statement, he said he grabbed his glasses and ran downstairs as fast as he could. As a matter of fact, in his statement to the police on the 8th, he said, quote, "I woke up quickly and grabbed my glasses on the nightstand and ran downstairs as fast as I could," unquote. In this very same testimony that we're talking about now, a little earlier, he said, quote, "I jumped up and I put on my glasses and I put my pants on and I ran down the stairs as fast as I could." So the glasses testimony has remained the same, but the pants testimony has not. So let's move on. Let's move on to the psychic. So evidently, Darin and Darlie had gone to visit a psychic to get some answers that they just couldn't get. And Mr. Davis objects to this as hearsay. But, earlier when Davis, the prosecutor, was talking about Jamie Johnson, the CPS worker, and then he talked about what Corrine Wells, the woman who lives in the Routier's old place, had to say, the defense never objected to this information. So, because wasn't that hearsay also? Shouldn't they have? I'm just a regular person who doesn't know anything about how all this should work. So if someone out there has an idea as to whether or not they should have, or that would have been the proper thing to do, I would love to know that. Darin then talks about the rent of his business building being $525 a month, and that they had just paid off all of their equipment that they had a loan out for. So this loan was for about $75,000 and it was all paid by January. But the thing is that the question that he was asked was about his bills each month, like his bills like electricity, phone bills, etc. And he said that it was around $5,000 a month. Now, I'm guessing that this includes his home and business, or maybe it's just his business. I'm not really clear on this. Mr. Mulder is then talking to Darin about his bills and kind of sneaks a question in there, asking Darin about Barbara Jovel, or Baja, as she is known, and her mental issues. Now, this was discussed significantly in other testimony, and the judge did not allow Barbara's mental health to be known to the jury. We had found out that Barbara has, in today's terms, bipolar disorder, and I believe she had been institutionalized at some point, but the jury never got to hear that. And of course, when this gets brought up in court, they're like, "Hey, we've discussed this. You can't talk about this anymore." We then hear about a June bank statement for the business, which has a balance of over $7,000. Darin is then asked if his mortgage was current, and he said that it was in June. He then said that the payment wasn't due until late on the 15th. Now, this is the same thing that Darin had said about his rent payment as well in an earlier episode. Its payments weren't due until late on the 15th. But I want to point out that in this back and forth, when Darin is asked about if his mortgage is current, obviously meaning everything is fine and up to date, Darin instead responds with, in his comment, quote, "in June." So he answers the question, kind of. Darin then lets us know that he has personally $800,000 of life insurance on him. He said he also believes that Darlie has $200,000 and that there was $5,000 on each child just for insurance riders. So the questioning then turns to the sock. And Darin does admit, he didn't exactly admit earlier, but he does this time, that yes, he would say that it is his sock, And then the questioning turns to Darlie while she was in the hospital. And what's mentioned is the fact that her family was feeding her ice chips because her mouth was all swollen and she had cuts inside of her lips. And that's doesn't go much further than that. That's all that they said. They didn't expand on that or anything. Then the Recross by Greg Davis begins. And Davis essentially accuses Darin and his memory of getting better as more test results come in for Darlie. He then pulls out a letter, and this letter was talked about earlier. This is the letter from the mortgage company that said that their mortgage, the Routiers' mortgage, hadn't been paid in April and May of 1996, and that they were in default. They owed $2,525, and the payment was to be made by May 23rd, or they were at risk of foreclosure. Now, earlier, remember, Darin had said that he made a payment on the mortgage in June. However, the amount of this payment wasn't stated, so we don't know if he made one mortgage payment for the month of June or if he paid the full amount that was due based on this letter. It was then brought up that on June the 3rd, Darin had gone to a bank and tried to get a $5,000 loan. We learned about this way earlier in the testimony. This was an unsecured loan, but they would not let him have it unless it was a secured loan. And they reference the testimony done by Oki Williams, which was well at the beginning of the testimony. I'll link to that below in the show notes for you in the event that you want to listen to her testimony. Davis then brings up the fact that at another hearing on July the 1st, which I don't have, unfortunately, Darin was making himself out to be kind of down and out, at least financially. But now he's making it look like nothing is an issue, at least where money is concerned. And I know that Davis is trying to get across to the jury that the whole reason for the kids being is for financial reasons. But honestly, this doesn't make any sense. They were insured for just $5,000 each. Now, Darlie, on the other hand, had she passed away, she was worth around $200,000. And yes, I know that I'm painting Darin as a major suspect here, but consider this as well. Darin, according to him, was worth $800,000. Now, if Darlie were in fact just after the money, why wouldn't she have targeted Darin? None of it makes any sense. Davis then starts his closing up his questioning of Darin by talking about the lucky intruder. And he does actually make some good points. That this guy happened to pick a house where the window was open in the garage, happened to pick a house where the alarm was not set. The utility room door was unlocked. In the utility room, they find a sock to use. Once inside the house, they had the use of a knife in the butcher block. But quite honestly, who of us does not have knives sitting in our kitchen, right? Probably right on the counter. Darlie doesn't wake up during the attack. She doesn't see this guy's face. This guy drops the knife. There's no blood on the floor or the window, and then leaves the backyard and either hops over the fence without any evidence of him doing so, or goes through the gate and closes and latches the gate. So once Davis is all done, Mulder begins his redirect, and he follows up on this quote-unquote lucky intruder by introducing his own points. And he says, yeah, it's lucky that the police didn't pursue any of the leads that they had. That when people did call in, saying that they saw a man in a black ball cap and t-shirt and jeans in the area, the police didn't pursue it. That Angelia Rickles had called them to tell them what had happened to her. Remember, she had somebody try and break into her home, but the police didn't pursue that lead, and they didn't pursue the fingerprint that was left as this person went out the window. So that's where we end with Darin's testimony. Next up to testify is Dr. Vincent DeMaio, and he is a renowned gunshot wound expert and a board-certified anatomical, clinical, and forensic pathologist. So he is up next and will be our next episode. Thank you all so much for listening. You are truly, truly appreciated. If you did like today's episode, please give it a thumbs up or leave a comment on the YouTube podcast page. And don't forget to subscribe as well so you don't miss out on future episodes. And if you want to go ahead and support the podcast, another way to do it is through Buy Me a Coffee. And you'll find the link to that in the show notes below. So again, thank you. I will be back very soon with the testimony of Dr. DeMaio. Thank you all. Bye for now.